What's up, guys? This is Heis, and today we're going to try and do every major piece of American railroad history in under 20 minutes. God help us, let's see if we can do it. Part 1. The beginning to Transcontinental. Starting with the first railroad in the United States, the Baltimore and Ohio, and this is defined as a railroad by being officially chartered as a common carrier. The Baltimore and Ohio was chartered by the state of Maryland on February 28th, 1827, making it the first railroad in the United States. And this is only 4 years after the first public railroad in England in 1823. Early railroads in the US didn't really look like what they do today. Originally, the B&O used horses to pull their trains. Their first locomotive, the Tom Thumb, blew minds by going 10 miles an hour, and it only survived a couple of years until 1834. In fact, its replica at the B&O Museum is almost 100 years old itself. Early locomotives bore very little resemblance to what you think of when you think steam train. A fun fact about early railroad companies in the US is that a lot of them were actually chartered by canal companies to help extend or bolster their existing operations. That's the way we already moved freight. Here's the new way to do it. Let's integrate those two pieces. And though the railroads and their equipment may not have looked like what you would expect, some of them stuck around for quite some time, most notably being the Strasburg Railroad, chartered in 1832. It still exists, and you can still ride behind a steam train this very day in 2025 at that railroad. Perhaps the first normal-looking locomotive design you'd think of is the 440. It was patented by Henry R. Campbell in 1836, though the first one had a rigid frame, which made it really strong and was way more powerful than anything previous, but it wasn't really good at curves and all that sort of stuff. The kind of standard 440 design came a little bit later, around the 1850s, with something that looked like the William Mason. This is really the poster child of early American railroading, especially in the West. When you think Hollywood Western and trains, you're thinking of these. These locomotives were so ubiquitous that they were called American standards. Recall that the white notation, that 440, actually was something that was a product of the 1900s, and we did a video about that. There's going to be a lot of videos that go along with these topics that are going to be popping up in whichever upper corner it is, so make sure you check those out if you want to know more. These locomotive designs would carry us all the way up to the American Civil War of the 1860s. And this is when railroads actually played a huge logistical piece of the war, really for the first time in the United States. And one of the myths surrounding that is that the North had a better, more standardized, more standard gauge railroad system, and that's really not the truth. The North had just as many gauge issues as the South, and right before the war, there actually was a little separate war called the Erie Gauge War that was all about what gauge the railroad should be, and railroads not agreeing on gauge. Look it up, it's pretty crazy. The North actually had some special trains that had extra wide wheel sets so that they could run on multiple disparate gauges that were within inches of each other, but just not standardized yet. Perhaps the most notable story of the Civil War in regards to trains was the Great Locomotive Chase, which was parodied quite greatly by Buster Keaton back in the early days of film, where a northern set of raiders went into the South, stole locomotives, and caused as much havoc on the way back as they could as the South chased them, and it makes for a great story in American folklore. Railroads and how they affected the Civil War is a huge, gigantic topic that deserves its own video, and that's going to be true of a number of topics within this video, so please let me know in the comments down below if you want a deep dive video on any of these particular topics. Right around the same time as the Civil War, the federal government passes the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, calling for a transcontinental railroad to be built. Construction begins in 1866 and is finished on May 10th, 1869, when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit in Utah. Central Pacific from the west brought the Jupiter, and Union Pacific from the east brought the 119 nose-to-nose to celebrate the linking of east and west by rail for the first time. Well, sort of. One fun argument that errs on the side of pedantic is that at Council Bluffs, Iowa, where the Missouri River was crossed, they still had to use a ferry. There wasn't a bridge quite yet, but during the winter, they actually just laid rails across the ice, so it was transcontinental-ish. It's a fun little detail that was remedied 1870, shortly thereafter, but one of those fun pieces of history where it's like, wait a second, they had to use a ferry, or they laid rails on the ice? the truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. Either way, we celebrate May 10, 1869. This meant that you didn't have to build locomotives and cars in the West or ship parts around the Horn down past South America because the Panama Canal wasn't done yet, and that traveling to the West was no longer this arduous adventure that would take weeks and potentially kill everyone. You'd just ride a train, and there you went. And thus the American West was gonna boom. And this was the first of many transcontinental railroads. A number of other railroads would also complete this feat later. Central Pacific and Union Pacific were just the first ones. Part 2. The turn of the century changes everything. In 1887 comes the first time regulations come around. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 creates the Interstate Commerce Commission, which means that the railroads are now regulated by the federal government of the US, which makes them the first industry of the US to ever experience that. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for that regulation to have some effect on the railroads. Trains are made of lots and lots of cars, and you need something to hold those cars together. In the early days, we used link and pin couplers, just a link and a pin, and that was not the ideal method. These days, almost everything in the US uses knuckle couplers. The progenitor of the modern knuckle coupler is the Janey coupler, patented by Eli H. Janey in 1873. Janey patented the important part, the shape of the knuckles such that all the cars could mate, but the internal guts and everything that connected them and how they operated was very not standardized, and it took some time for that to get fixed. This was solved by the Master Car Builders Organization in 1913 by adopting the Type D coupler as standard. The MCB was renamed to the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, in 1934. The AAR still regulates a ton of things about compatibility to this very day, about rolling stock and a little bit of everything else. As trains got longer and heavier, a more sophisticated means of stopping them than sending dudes running across the top with sticks was needed. George Westinghouse would invent the first air brake in 1869. Around the same time, vacuum brakes were being developed as well and had been in development for a long time in Britain already. Vacuum brakes operate on the same principle as air brakes, just with the opposite pressure. Vacuum made a ton of sense for a steam engine, because you could just use some steam pressure and some clever nozzle arrangements to generate vacuum with no moving parts. However, the vacuum systems that were developed in the US had the same problems as Westinghouse's original air brake system, where if you lost connection through all the cars, you had no braking power anymore. Westinghouse solved this problem in 1872 with the automatic air brake, but we were a little slow on the vacuum side of this. The British had already invented an automatic type of vacuum system that automatically put on the brakes as soon as the hoses separated. And this was learned by Fred W. Eames, who was the leader of the main manufacturer of vacuum brakes, who was on a tour to Britain trying to sell his inferior straight vacuum brake. When he came back to the US excited to come up with his own system that was automatic, it turns out there had been some issues with the way his shop had been sublet, which resulted in him getting murdered by one of his own employees. And so the knowledge took a little bit longer, and automatic vacuum came pretty late in the United States. Eames's company would go on to invent a US-based automatic vacuum system in 1885, but by that time, most trains in the US were too long for vacuum to be really practical, and one of the major companies that had been using Eames vacuum brakes realized that vacuum doesn't work so well at 12,000 feet of elevation where there's less air. Both knuckle couplers and some sort of powered brake, along with a number of other considerations, were made required for most railroads by the Safety Appliance Act of 1893, which would be enforced starting in 1900. I've done deep dive videos on couplers and brakes before. Make sure you go check them out if you want to know some more details. Also worth noting is that railroads didn't really implement these things side by side. There were a lot of railroads that ended up having air brakes and link and pin. The overlap is kind of fun. Towards the end of the 1800s was a big time for the railroads. The networks had gotten pretty big, and there was no real way for a fledgling trucking industry to compete, and aviation wasn't even a consideration. Railroads were some of the biggest companies around. In fact, in 1882, the Pennsylvania Railroad was not just the biggest railroad in the United States, it was the largest corporation in the world. Of any type. It made up like 25% of the US GDP. One railroad! However, everyone wanting a piece of that same pie meant that as World War I breaks out, there are a ton of railroads, many of which have overexpanded, and they've not really maintained their networks or their equipment much in the last couple decades. An indicator of this was noted by my friend Josh, who's a historian, who's actually the historian who helped with this video, and he makes his own videos about railroad history, so make sure you check him out. Josh noted that apparently 70% of boxcars that were used in grain service in the United States at this period leaked significantly, and significantly enough that a quarter of the US food supply had been dropped into the gauge on the rails. A quarter of the whole food supply. Yeah, the railroads were not doing so hot. The war begins and traffic skyrockets, and because of the difference in profits, the railroads didn't really want to haul the empties back. All the loads were going to the ports, but no empties coming back. This ended up with 100,000 cars stuck in the East. Something had to change. From December 28th, 1917 until March 1st, 1920, the railroads in the USA were nationalized by the government run by the United States Railroad Administration, USRA, originally authorized by the Army Appropriation Act of 1916. It's remembered as nationalization, but in reality the government was renting the railroads with promise to give them back to their original owners in as good or better condition than they got them in. Your results may vary. The USRA had sole control, so they were able to handle all the logistics and routing of everything, so things just flowed really well. As well, the USRA introduced a number of standardized designs that really helped things out, and they were pretty significantly good as well. They brought together the best minds in the industry of railroading to come up with these standard designs, and they had a huge lasting impact. More copies of the designs were made after the war than were made during the war. And a fun fact, the last domestic Baldwin was a USRA 2662, and the last steam-era built steam locomotive was a USRA 080. Though the USRA did end up handing back the railroads to their original owners in 1920, the way that goods moved through the US had changed. The automobile had arrived. Part 3. Competition, Technology, and World War II. From 1900 to 1920, the amount of cars and trucks in the US had multiplied by 1,000. That, plus the fact that we're seeing the dawn of aviation, meant that a lot of the branch lines really didn't make any sense for the railroads anymore. And it ultimately caused a lot of them to get abandoned. The US rail system peaked in terms of route miles in 1916 with 254,037 miles of track. It was around this same time that the internal combustion type locomotives started to increase in prevalence. There were many experimental units that dated to even pre-1900, but it wasn't until 1925 that we see the first diesel-electric locomotive that was commercially successful like those of today. The Central of New Jersey number 1000. It was built by a coalition of General Electric, Ingersoll Rand, and the American Locomotive Company. The diesel-electric became the common choice because of the heavy infrastructure requirements for electrifying a rail line. Most alignments didn't have the traffic density to deal with that expense, particularly at a time when a lot of the smaller lines were decreasing in service and confidence wasn't really there to spend on the infrastructure. That's largely why the dense or dedicated urban systems got electrified, but nothing long-haul ever really got electrified in the US, barring some exceptions. And then the growth of the automobile and freedom and driving behind the car and that whole cultural mentality killed off most of those urban systems, and we kind of wish we had them back. Oops. These early diesel locomotives were largely used in switching and urban areas. The first diesel locomotives that are more similar to what we run today came around in the 1930s with EMD's FT, which had multiple unit control, more horsepower, and a reliable diesel engine that became EMD's architecture platform for 50 plus years. The ability for one engineer to operate multiple locomotives with a fair amount of horsepower meant that diesel could finally compete with steam on the main. That said, steam did not go down without a fight. The 1930s and the 1940s saw the arrival of the modern steam locomotive. Truly impressive feats of engineering with how much they could pull or how fast they could do it, with all of these extra beautiful systems added in to squeeze every little bit of efficiency out of these monstrous machines as possible. The diesel locomotive hadn't really proven itself yet, and with World War II on the horizon, some really big power was needed. World War II came around, and it limited the availability of humans for train crews. And with diesels having not been proven, some truly gargantuan steam locomotives were built. The Big Boy, the Alleghenies, the Y6 classes, you name it, these locomotives were incredible, and they arrived on the scene just when they were needed. During and immediately after World War II was also the Romantic era for rail travel in the USA. Most every railroad had its own flagship train with striking liveries and good service. When people reminisce about the golden age of train travel, this is the period that they're thinking of.
I hope they get the eggs.
Iconic streamlined locomotives and every rail company trying to outdo each other. However, increased competition from the automobile with the expansion of the interstate highway system and more airliners being used, it meant that the long-haul passenger routes really didn't make any economic sense for the companies anymore, and this beautiful golden age was not around for long. Post-World War II meant the end of steam in the US. EMD, having successfully proven multiple unit control and a significant reliability increase while also having a significant reduction in maintenance, meant that the steam locomotives were not going to stick around long after the war. Railroads got rid of steam through the 1940s and the 1950s in most cases, though certain coal hauling roads and certain perhaps edge case narrow gauge operations ended up sticking around a fair bit later. The general consensus is that most mainline US steam was totally gone by 1960, which is in pretty great contrast to a lot of the world. Mexico, Britain, Australia, and many other countries ran very, very late, and some places are still running steam. But for the US, we gotta give a special mention to our podunk little Colorado narrow gauge, where the DNRGW had revenue service steam until 1980, though the ultimate title for latest revenue service steam goes to the Crab Orchard and Egyptian, which ran revenue steam until 1986. Part 4. The Modern Era. Throughout U.S. railroading history, it's been dog-eat-dog for the railroad companies, exacerbated by the competition from trucking. Mergers, takeovers, multiple bankruptcies, all were quite common, and that did not change post-World War II. In fact, it got even maybe a little bit more obvious because the amount of companies dwindled. A big railroad in the U.S. is known as a Class 1 railroad, and that designation is based on their annual revenue. Take a look at the Wikipedia list for former Class 1s. It is ridiculous. And now take a look at the modern list and note that there are 7. The BNSF Railway, the Canadian National, the Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CSX Transportation, Norfolk Southern, and Union Pacific for the freight carriers, and then Amtrak for passenger. This is largely due to the Motor Carrier Act and the Staggers Rail Act, both of 1980, which deregulated trucking and rail. These acts both gave the trucking and rail companies a ton of control over rates and how things were to operate, essentially, which helped lead to a lot of these big mergers. Perhaps the example that set the stage for all of these big mergers, though, was the formation of Conrail in the East. After the big freight roads in the East all went bankrupt, basically, it was a government-run, set-up entity to try and keep service flowing over there, and it ran under the government until it turned a profit, and then it was privatized and ultimately ended up as parts of NS and CSX. Throughout this video, we've talked a lot about how competition kept hurting railroads, and it really hit them in the passenger space. Long-distance trains, once the remarkable flagship, could not compete with a jet airliner. The railroads petitioned the government, and in 1970, the Rail Passenger Service Act created Amtrak, a federal entity to operate the passenger trains. Amtrak's first service was May 1st, 1971. All the while this is happening, diesel locomotive technology is just getting better and better. The first generation of diesel locomotives were the ones that shared the rails with the steam engines, and they kind of set the platform and the archetype for how the diesel-electric locomotive was going to work. The second generation of diesel locomotives was built to be bigger and better and replace the first generation rather than steam locomotives, and they had a fair bit more horsepower. The third generation of diesel locomotives is when they started to get a little bit smarter, with electronic controls, electronic fuel injection, and better electronics for managing traction. It's in this generation estimation that we kind of settle on 4,000 to 4,400 horsepower per unit on average. Anything more on the big 6-axle platform really just tore up wheels and rails, and that's where we found the happy medium that makes up the design of locomotives today. The fourth and current generation of diesel locomotives comes around in the mid-1990s, where you get AC traction motors. AC traction motors have much less maintenance, and they have much better electronic traction control than DC traction motors. These locomotives are also significantly improving in emissions standards, especially in the modern era, which is largely due to significant regulations surrounding those emission criteria. These days, it's very common to see third and fourth generation diesel locomotives operating on mainline freights, with some second generation diesels still kicking around switching things around. Speaking of modern day trains in the US, the big news is PTC. Positive train control. Many railroads actually had safety systems that told the engineers what signals were up ahead within the cab, or could even stop trains that ran past a red signal. Dating back to the steam era, nothing was ever federally mandated across all roads like PTC until 2008. In September of 2008, a train wreck involving a Metrolink commuter train and a Union Pacific freight train ended up killing 25 people and injuring more than 100 because the engineer on the Metrolink train was texting on his phone, didn't see a red signal, and they had a head-on collision, and it was horrifying. The month after, Congress passed the Rail Improvement Safety Act of 2008, which mandates PTC, a safety system that can automatically stop trains, not after they've done something wrong, but before, an overlay that can help the engineer in case he misses something. PTC was mandated to be installed on any line that had commuter trains or carried certain hazmat. Implementation took a long time, but as of the 2020s, any train that needs to have PTC can't run without it. The other truly big thing in American railroading in modern times is PSR. Precision Scheduled Railroading. Precision Scheduled Railroading is all about efficiency, and particularly making the most money for the railroad. Railroads have described PSR as the operational method of running a railroad for maximum asset utilization by which freight movements are scheduled and managed on the individual carload rather than the entire train level. That contributes to efficiency improvements by, for instance, using more direct point-to-point routing, bypassing classification terminals, and having the flexibility to use long mixed commodity trains. There are no shortage of opinions that fly around PSR that I'm going to try and stick mostly out of, but generally it's caused a reduction of classification yards, consolidating dispatch and mechanical forces, and reducing the number of employees working, as well as reducing capital budgets while trying to increase the utilization of assets. And if you don't speak corporate, they want to do the most with what they have, which means running big trains to locations that are easily serviced rather than directly servicing a customer. Trains are regularly literal miles long, some stretching up to 20,000 feet or 6,100 meters, but still only operated by one crew. Generally, it seems that shareholders are happy, but customers and employees aren't. Yeah, look into that one if you want. I'm sure many of you will have comments down below. You guys can explain it better than I can what it's like to be a PSR railroad employee at this point. Anyways, guys, that was about as quick as we could blitz through the whole history of American railroading from the beginning to the end, while still covering some amount of the details in the middle. I hope you guys found it interesting, and I hope you learned something along the way. As always, please let me know if there's any one of those topics that you'd like a specific deep dive on. They're all really interesting and so much more nuanced than you can pack into a 20-minute video. I want to give a special shout out to Josh, Wings and Strings, and Leighton Moreland for helping me out with this video, providing a lot of the details and double checking my facts. And I want to thank all of you guys for watching. It really makes a difference, and I really appreciate that you guys enjoy these fun train facts on the channel. Yeehaw! That was a marathon to put together. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, thanks so much for watching. We'll catch y'all next time. Oh, hey, you made it past the credits. Gotta thank Physicist's partner as well. It's at Puffing Billy Railway in Australia. And Physicist brought up a phone call with his partner, and they asked about specifically a General American Railroad primer, and I was like, wasn't aware of one. And then I went, well, crap. Why haven't I done one? And there it was. So cheers to you guys.